Good morning, everybody. My name is Crispin Son. I'm the chairperson of FoodBank in South Africa, known as Food Forward South Africa. I'm an executive director and partner of Commemorate Investments, also based in South Africa and working across the continent of Africa. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome about 300 registered participants from 52 countries today to be part of our program. It's the first International Awareness Day, raising awareness for food loss and food waste as part of the Sustainable Development Goals 12.3, specifically focusing on those two issues. So welcome to each and every one of you to this momentous day and an important day to start dealing with some of the issues we face around food security globally. The Development Goal 12.3 and the rest of the development goals were launched and made available to the world on the 25th of September 2015. At that stage, it was a quarter of a century ahead of the authors of the goal, and we all look forward to the outcomes of and making progress with regards to reducing hunger on a global basis. 5 years have passed, 10 years lie ahead. We are now confronted with the challenge of amending the behavior and attitude of about 8 billion people, specifically with regards to the use and availability of food. So today we will be spending quite a bit of time thinking and focusing and hearing some of our expert panelists on what has been done and what still needs to be done in order for us to realize these goals and these ambitions. We have a great panel of speakers lined up for you today, people who span private sector, public sector, who are involved in policy making, but more importantly, share a very deep passion for eradicating hunger and at a macro level across the world and then on this planet we find ourselves on at the same time. 2020 certainly has been a momentous year. If nothing else, it served to highlight the plight of those who are food insecure and certainly highlight the fissures in our global society, specifically with regards to some of the basic needs like food and water. So today we will have panelists to talk through that with us and share their unique insights around what has been done and what still needs to be done. Before I speak about the panelists, there are a couple of housekeeping rules that I'd like to share with you. One of our speakers, Maria, will be speaking in Spanish. There is on the feature a translation capability on the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side, that allows you to choose a language of translation. Please feel free to use that. There'll also be an opportunity for you to ask questions and for the panelists to respond to those questions at the end of the session. So we please encourage you to type in those questions in the chat box and ensure that your questions are heard and to ensure that your questions are answered. We look forward to your participation. The session is recorded, and so what you say is on record, and it's also, I'm sure a transcript will be available for those who require it. I am, of course, very humbled and honored at the same time to be part of this conversation, but more humbled by the panelists and looking through their resume, people who've spent a lot of time grappling with issues not only about food distribution and about access to food, but also the policies that are involved around the distribution, the manufacture of food, and the availability of food to more people. So first on the panel, we're delighted to have Steve Callaghan, who's currently the President and the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Kellogg's. Steve, welcome. Steve is not a newcomer to the industry. He spent a lot of time as the president of Coca-Cola in the Americas. He spent time at AB InBev. So Steve, really welcome to have you, and we look forward to your insights this morning.
Great, thank you, Crispin. Great to be with you all.
Thank you. We have from the Netherlands, Franz Muller, who is the president and CEO of Ahold Delhaize. delays. Franz is also no stranger to the food sector. He spent time as the managing director at Macro before this, and then spent many years in the C-suite at Ahold. And Franz, we're very happy to have you and to hear from you during the course of this morning's discussion.
Thank you, Crispin, and happy to contribute today.
Thank you. Catherine Bettini, who is the Distinguished Fellow of the Global Food and Agriculture Desk of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, is also the chairman of GAIN, and has an extensive history and personal journey with regards to food security globally. Catherine, we're very happy to have you with us this morning. Catherine, I think you're on mute. The stock standard phrase these days.
Thank you, Crispin, for the invitation. I'm pleased to be here.
Nice to have you. And then we have Liz Goodwin, who is, I'd like to say, the champion of champions, the champion of the Champions program for the Millennial Goal 12.3, and a senior fellow and director for food loss and waste from the World Resources Institute. Liz is also a trained chemist. So Liz, thank you. We look forward to your contribution. I think you've probably got a very strong technical contribution to make, but we look forward to hearing from you as well.
Thank you, Crispin. It's great to be here.
And then from Mexico, we have Maria Teresa Garcia Plata, who is the general manager from Bancos Alimentos de Mexico. Maria finds herself in banking, but has also experience in food banking, being the director of one of the food banks in Mexico, and having spent time in marketing in one of the biggest dairy groups in Mexico. Maria, very welcome this morning.
Muchas gracias, Crispin. Gracias a todos.
Thank you very much, Crispin. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And then last but certainly not least is Lisa Moon. Lisa is the president and CEO of the Global Food Banking Network, and Lisa is the co-host through the Global Food Banking Network of today's discussion. Lisa, very nice to have you, and always a pleasure to be with you on a panel like this.
Thanks, Crispin.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go dive straight into it, and Steve, if you don't mind fielding the first question. Kellogg sits at pretty much the pinnacle among food companies, and certainly in the top tier, and it's been deeply involved, certainly in South Africa. It also has a reputation for being very deeply involved in food security. Maybe you can tell us what the company's done and is doing as part of its commitment to food waste in South Africa, globally. Sorry, forget the parochial comment, what it's doing globally. And also talk to us a little bit about the 10 by 20 and 30 initiative, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And we are doing a lot in South Africa as well as around the world. As a global food company, it's our responsibility to play a role here. And we've got something called Better Days, which is our commitment around a number of initiatives like this. But when it comes to food waste, we really have to do our part. And we have been stepping up. If we look at the food that we grow and make, we want to go to people, right? And that is happening at over 99% rate. But that means we can still do better. We absolutely need to do better. It's part of our commitment to addressing the interconnected issues of well-being, food security, and climate. And it's all part of, again, our Better Days, where we commit to 3 billion better days by 2030. And so why the 10 by 20 by 30? As I said, we're already operating at a very high level, but to meet commitments that are even greater than that, we have to know what we don't know. And so, for example, Franz, who's on the call, Franz is going to see things at his end of the supply chain. He and his team will see things that are not necessarily visible to my team, and they can share those things, those insights around how we can do better with respect to food waste. Equally, we are going to see things backward in our supply chain that our suppliers are not going to see. How they route, how they deliver, how food shows up and raw materials show up at our plants that we can share so that they can continue to drive their best practices. And so you really need to look at the interconnectedness of the entire supply chain in order to get to that next level of achievement. And that only happens when you have the types of commitments up and down the supply chain to collaborate, to share, to press each other. And that's why I think the 10 by 20 by 30 initiative is so important, because it shines a light onto the things that are not going to be necessarily in front of any one actor in the supply chain. And so that's why we're very excited to take part in that. We think it will help us get to our commitments faster and better. And we believe it will help all the actors in the supply chain continue to elevate their performance.
Thank you, Steve. I mean, I think you've really highlighted the complexity of the challenge, and the complexity of this goal. And I'd like to move to you, Franz, if you don't mind. And 2020 is going to be synonymous with many things, but I think most certainly COVID-19. And I know you have been doing a lot personally, but so has Ahold Delhaize done a lot with regards to managing food waste. Maybe you want to tell us a little bit about your approach to it, but also just tell us a little bit about the impact COVID-19 has had on your endeavors and on your business. And I'm sure many of the participants would like to hear from you.
Thank you, Crispin. For those who might not know Ahold Delhaize, we are a supermarket company. We're operating 7,000 stores and servicing 7,000 communities with 54 million customers a week. We are working very hard to reduce food waste, because as you can imagine, food waste has its origin in not selling products which sit on the shelf or at a certain time are not good to sell anymore. So we have a high interest to avoid that also from a cost perspective. The second thing is that we would like to reduce food waste as soon as it's unsold, and therefore we work very closely together with our communities to relieve hunger, because that is of course a much better destination for food, unsold food, than it might come to landfill. We work with three approaches. We try to avoid unsold food, so we work very much on forecasting and replenishment and a cool change, as you can imagine, in our stores and our warehouses, and a close collaboration also with our suppliers, vendors, and logistics partners. Secondly, we work very closely with food banks and charities to make sure that unsold products get a good destination. And the third thing is that if there are products which are no longer suitable for human consumption, then we divert them to other recycling methods, for example, animal feed, composting, and energy. And it's a strong target in our company to have reduced food waste by 50% in 2030. We're working very hard to make those targets work. And Steve already mentioned 10 by 20 by 30, 10 retailers, 20 manufacturers working together to halve food waste in 2030. And what Steve mentioned is absolutely true. This is a very much pre-competitive, collaborative topic here to reduce food waste. So those are a few things on food waste. Coming back to your second question, what's the impact of COVID-19? It's a very counterintuitive COVID-19. First of all, a lot of unsold products come to the food banks. As you can imagine, a lot of retailers and manufacturers donate products to food banks to support communities. In COVID-19, with the hoarding behavior in all the stores, all the food stuff was sold. So we also had much less to donate to food banks. While at the same time, in the communities, a lot of people got in trouble. Schools closed, job losses, and these kind of things. So we face a lot of challenges for food banks as such. And that's why we're working with a lot of food bank organizations to make sure that we find other ways to support the food banks if unsold food is not the main thing. So then we talk about money donations. Feeding America, for example, is an important partner for us, but also donating a lot of meal kits and food as well in kind. And the other thing is that with COVID-19, as we all seen in all our markets, restaurants, hotel, hospitality closed down as well. So there was a lot of food service, let's say, quantities of food which had no destination anymore because the food restaurants were closed. And we picked up a lot of those food products, and together with the food service industry, we were able to reroute, let's say, trucks of poultry or trucks of products to food banks and to our stores. So difficult situation with COVID-19, as we all have seen, and those are a few things we did, Crispin, to deal with this.
Franz, thank you. Thanks very much for that response. Catherine, if I may turn to you, one of the biggest challenges I guess human beings face is overcoming that base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is getting food and then shelter. And for many people, it's a reality to seek food in a food insecure environment. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about, how we start working with improving the quality of people's diet, and particularly those people at the base of the hierarchy, and then also how we start driving efforts towards improving accessibility and availability for people who are food insecure.
Sure. Thank you very much, Crispin, and thank you, Steve and Franz, for not only for what you said today, but the thoughtful and responsible ways in which your companies are dealing with these issues. There are, at every step of the way of the food chain, there has to be a really responsible reaction, or we'll never actually make enough of a dent on this issue that we'd like to. And that starts in the farmer's field, where so much of the time there is a lot of waste, not because they want it to be that way, but just because they don't necessarily have the right kinds of equipment or labor in order to properly harvest it, and sometimes because they have no markets for it. And I think when we think about the right kinds of food that we need to be providing, and we put a high priority on fruits and vegetables, of course, they're also foods that are very perishable. So one of the things I think we have to do a better job of is figuring out how to go from the field to the household, especially in poor households, and especially when there's limited amount of electricity, therefore refrigeration, and also kind of challenged distribution systems. And that relates also to the issue of people knowing that the fruits and vegetables are really high quality food that they should be consuming. I think worldwide we do a terrible job at educating people, and this starts in countries like the US or throughout Europe. I think we don't do a good enough job in educating people about what are the right kinds of food to eat, and what are the right kinds of food to eat at different stages of their lives, so that we can better focus on those needs throughout life. And so I think paying attention to the distribution system from the farm is one issue. Two is more education. And we saw now that during COVID, there were huge, and Franz made references, but there were huge need changes that probably many of which could not be predicted. And we saw in the US milk being dumped because it couldn't be distributed because their customers changed, right? They weren't going to send them to schools anymore, and they weren't packaged the right way to send them to grocery stores, and they couldn't be used in restaurants, which were closed. So we learned over time how to make some changes in that, but we weren't perhaps as nimble as we could have been. So systemically in each country, there has to be more, and perhaps in each subset of the country, states, provinces, counties, whatever, we need to think about the distribution there. I know in the little rural county where I live, there is a newly invigorated hunger coalition that really looks very carefully at different communities to say what else is needed here and how can we get it. And perhaps that would be part ultimately of an SDG success, that we had that kind of active community involvement, looking directly at local communities and what we need. And then just two other quick points. One is, I think in our own homes, if we think about the individuals who support food banking around the world, we have to even be more critical about how we use food in our own homes and how we get excess food to food banks in a timely manner before it's too late. And that's in another education process that I think we could actively involve ourselves in. Finally, research, especially on post-harvest loss. If you look at the totality of ag research around the world, section is the weakest that are developed. There's a lot of research on marketing, but there's not a lot of research on what happens with post-conflict. So, I'm sorry, post-harvest. So that's a priority for perhaps our national governments, if not our research institutions. Thank you.
Thanks. I appreciate the fact that you also bring this down to us as individuals in our own homes. I think that's one thing that we always look at these things systemically, but it starts with individual behavior. So thanks for adding that, Catherine. Liz, last week the Champions 12.3 had your annual event, and the theme this year was Success or Crisis in 2030, the fight to halve food loss and waste. Do you want to share with us some of the key points of those deliberations?
Yes, thank you. I mean, we have an annual session where we review where we are. As you say, we're 5 years in now and we've got 10 years left to go. So it feels like an important moment to say, are we doing enough? And I think the key things coming out of the discussion this time, I mean, clearly COVID-19's had a massive impact and everyone's seen impacts in different ways. But despite that, there are some shining lights of some things where progress is really happening. And we particularly talked a little bit about progress in the UK, where household food waste has actually fallen quite a lot. And overall, across the supply chains in the UK, including households, food waste is reduced by 27%. So that's over halfway to get into the Sustainable Development Goal. And there are also some companies who are making massive progress as well. And clearly one of the big things that came out was the announcement of both Steve and Franz have talked about 10 by 20 by 30. So we had the 10 big organizations last year. And today, this last week, we announced nearly 200 companies who are the cohorts of 20 of those 10 organizations. So you can see that you're starting to get real momentum building among businesses in terms of Target Measure Act and actually committing to reducing food waste, because it's now going down through the supply chains. But I think overall our feeling was that, the world is still woefully behind. We can't actually, unless we up our game, we're not going to get there. So on the back of that, Champions 12.3 published a call to action, which was basically 3 main bullet points. We want more companies and more governments to do Target Measure Act, to set targets, to measure, and then to take action. So really to prioritize it. We want more companies and governments to recognize the climate implications. We're not going to hit any of our climate goals unless we do something about food waste. So let's include it in nationally determined contributions. Let's include it in our climate strategies. And then thirdly, COVID-19, we're going to have to rebuild the food system. Let's take food waste and loss into account as we do that and actually address some of the problems. So those were some of the things that came out. No big solutions, but lots of energy. And I think everyone came away powered up to fight harder.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Liz. Lisa, if I could direct the conversation to you. Global Food Bank Network is releasing today, I believe, the Waste Not, Want Not report for 2020. I presume central to that is the role of food banks around the world. Maybe you can share with us a little bit what you think the role of food banks are, what they've been doing, and the potential role food banks can continue playing in the reduction of global hunger.
Sure. Thanks, Crispin. I just first of all want to say that although I'm sure the United Nations did not intend this when they chose 2020 to be the first year for an International Day of Awareness on Food Loss and Waste, I would argue that it's incredibly well timed because I really share Liz's sentiments that unless we see significant action, we're going to have a challenge meeting, certainly SDG 12.3 and potentially other SDGs by 2030. And it's because of leaders like Steve and Franz and Liz and so many others that are really prioritizing food loss and waste and the conversation around it. I think that we have a chance to make a big impact. The point that I really want to make too is that hunger very much so is both a production and a logistics challenge. And I think that bringing together the conversation around how do we reduce meaningfully food loss and waste, and how do we tackle SDG 2, which is zero hunger, is really critically important to the success of both SDGs. So this has to be, in my opinion, top of mind as we consider as a global community how to build a stronger, more inclusive, and more equitable food system. So food banks are one way, of course, to make this connection at the community-based level. Many, of course, who are joining today know that food banks are extraordinarily professional operations. They specialize in safely recovering surplus food and redirecting it to those facing hunger. So the Global Food Banking Network, or GFN for short, we're very fortunate to support food banks in 44 countries, and in normal times, 70% of the food that they are distributing is recovered from wholesome surplus streams from companies like Kellogg's, from retailers like those that work with Ahold Delhaize. And so it's really because of the partnerships with these multinational, local, and regional growers and producers that food banks are able to operate. That makes them very efficient. To give you an example, the food banks in our network, they are able to recover enough food for approximately 8 meals with just an investment of $1 because they're working with surplus streams. And the food banking model exists today in more than 70 countries. It's been adapted in a variety of cultural contexts, and it's really locally developed and adapted. And our good friend Maria from Bamex in Mexico will talk a little bit more about that, of course. So this is a local intervention that has a real possibility to be transformational, we think, for both the challenge of food loss and waste reduction as well as for hunger relief. And so last year, we really set out to try to quantify what the impact of food banking work is, specifically on the issues that are considered in the Sustainable Development Goals. So the scorecard that we released today reflects the work of food banks in more than 70 countries. The Global Food Banking Network, of course, covers most of Central and South America, much of Sub-Saharan Africa, and most of the Asia-Pacific region. And we joined together with our partners in Europe, the European Food Bank Federation, and with Feeding America to try to get a global snapshot of what the impact of food banking is in this year. And this data was really collected pre-COVID, so that of course has changed the game. But in 2019, food banks in those systems prevented approximately 12.39 billion kilograms of greenhouse gases from being released. And that's a big number, but essentially it's the equivalent of removing all the cars on the roads in Paris and Singapore combined. This was because they were able to divert 3.75 million metric tons of nutritious surplus food from landfills to people experiencing hunger. And collectively, those organizations provided meals to 66.5 million people in 70 countries. So the potential of this model is there. Obviously, the first point of order, as I know, Steve and Franz and Liv have emphasized, that prevention of food loss and waste is critical. But for what can't be prevented, all that is wholesome and surplus should be redirected to food banks or to an organization that can serve this redistribution function. And one last point I just want to make, of course, is that prior to COVID, you had 1 in 4 individuals globally that faced food insecurity. And this situation, of course, is dramatically worse because of the pandemic. And even today, the UNICEF Executive Director, Henrietta Holzman-Foer, announced on September 15th that we still have more than 800 million children children worldwide that are missing meals at school. A big part of our strategy, of course, is to make sure that those children are able to receive meals even during these closures. But we're going to need to come together as a global community now more than ever to really think about how do we tackle this dual challenge of food loss and waste, as well as improving food access for those that need it. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. I mean, the thing that strikes me about all the contributors so far is the link we're making between food security and the impact it has, or our inability to deal with it, the impact it's going to have on climate and on our macro environment as a planet, which also brings to mind the point that food and the way we deal with it is so central to all the SDG, all the Sustainable Development Goals. So Lisa, thanks for that. And I think you speak broadly about food banks. Coming to Maria, your experience has been also pretty much what's happening on the ground in a large economy such as Mexico. And maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the approach of the bank, Bancos de Alimentos de Mexico, and the 55 food banks that you guys are overseeing. And then you've also worked very closely with the Waste Resource Action Plan, with voluntary agreements in place to help with oversight on some of those initiatives. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about the voluntary agreements, and then also, what's the bank's approach to managing and working with those 55 food banks in Mexico?
Claro que sí, Crispin, con mucho
Of course,
gusto.
Crispin, a pleasure to share with you. The food banking network in Mexico has been in operation for over 3 decades, and just like our other food bankers in Latin America, we've always focused on food security. But like you pointed out, the two objectives right now are connected, interconnected. We want to promote food security, and we want to reduce waste and loss. Because when we talk about it in Mexico, we want to make sure that there is enough food for everybody. But however, the amount of product that is wasted every year, it's incredible. Every day, more and more so. So we want to have a very effective model that allows us to redistribute this product that's not going to be sold anymore, so that we can deliver it to those that need it, and we can do it in a safe and transparent way. So despite our focus being on food security, and that is how we introduce ourselves in Mexico and in Latin America, the reality is that the emphasis, because of the environment, because of what we're seeing in the world and what we contribute to the value chain, this is very important. It is very necessary as food banks to really concentrate on being an environmental organization. That is really very important, and it has to do with sustainable development. Just in Mexico, our 55 banks do an extraordinary work, and they rescue more than 120,000 tons of food every year that otherwise would have been wasted. And today, we're serving more than 2 million people. So when we hear our friends, our colleagues, Steve, and everything that's happening with the private initiative, I realize it's in our DNA, this idea that we know exactly what our role is. It's very holistic. We want to contribute to this first world order problems. We want to prevent waste and loss. The reality is not all companies are located in this chain yet, so that they can really contribute effectively to the solution for these two problems. And that's why with Bamex, we are really happy. We're very proud to have started a new collaboration with this organism that is a specialist in reducing food waste and loss. Waste Action is their program. We have joint efforts so that we can reach these voluntary agreements. The Pacto por la Comida is the name that we're going to give our effort in Mexico. We want to involve industry so that they can contribute to the reduction of food loss and waste from its point of origin and until the point where they reach their companies. It is worth mentioning that we are going to do food recovery. That is what we want to do. We want to use a proven method to do that so that we can promote safety and food security. But Also, Impacto por la Comida will involve actions to reduce food waste, the food waste that occurs specifically at the level of each one of those companies, so that we do not generate loss, especially food loss, at any point in their value chain or production chain. This allows us an opportunity as a country to really move the needle, to really have an impact on the results, and to really get close to the excellent results that other countries are reaching. People like the UK, they really have been able to reach higher levels, and we want to go in that direction. We want to have more and more companies that are committed to this, and we want them to implement these voluntary strategies. And we are very convinced at BAMIX that we're going to be able to do this work. These volunteer agreements allow us to gather different companies from the same sector in a non-competitive environment where they can share. We can all share the problems that we have. Finally, we see the same problems in company after company after company, so we can share good practices, and we can really measure, we can gauge to see what the results are of the actions that we implement to prevent food loss and waste. On top of that, all these collaborations allow us to connect with the government, because the government does play a role in this food security strategy, so that we can generate holistic changes. And we want to establish long-term change as well, looking at 10 years from now. It allows the exchange of good practices, and we do have to measure. This strategy of voluntary agreements means that we're going to set a goal for ourselves, what we want to have for 2030, then we want to measure, and measuring is extremely important. That is basic for us to be able to make decisions, the right decisions at all points, and we want to carry out actions, and that's what we're going to do. As a food banking network, we're going to be hand in hand working with the companies and all the different actors that are going to be working with us, and we are going to be able to participate in the solution of both areas. We want to reduce food waste and food loss, and we want to fight against food insecurity, and we also fight the COVID-19 pandemic at the same time.
Maria, thank you. I think firstly, congratulations for the progressive approach that the bank has taken on this. But you also speak about two things that I think are quite insightful. One is that you're dealing with this thing holistically throughout the value chain. Very often the attention is focused at wholesale or at retail level, but there's a real opportunity across the value chain. And secondly, also talking long-term, planning long-term, thinking about what are the things we learn from month to month, year to year, decade to decade, and how do we build that into our practice, attitudes, and behaviors over the long term. So thank you very much for that insight, and congratulations on the work that you're doing. I'm going to move to a second round of questions. I mean, there's one question I'm going to throw in, which is sort of my curveball, and whoever wants to answer that at some stage is, and I think, Liz, you mentioned it, you gave us a very clear sight about where you think we are in this process in terms of success or failure. Where are we in this 25-year period that we've set ourselves? So I'd like everyone just to think about that, and I'll come back to that question. In the meantime, Steve, if you don't mind, I'm going to come back to you and to Kellogg's, who is really noted for the work that you're doing around the world in dealing with hunger and dealing with greater access to food. And I think in the first round of questions, you've given us a very good context of why that's important for an organization such as Kellogg's. But maybe, you can talk a little bit about strategically how you think food banks are useful to an organization like Kellogg's in helping you achieve some of your other goals, access to food or some of probably the social goals, but I'm sure on the KPIs, there are a few other goals also for your executive team. And what role could food banks play in that, and what roles do they play in the Kellogg's environment?
Yeah, so, you alluded to it. I think, one of the overarching themes for companies like ours is if you want to do good, you have to do well, right? And so one of the motivations, beyond financial incentives for your company to be successful and do well is the motivation employees get that, we can then redirect and direct our attentions towards being great corporate citizens and doing good in our communities. And that drives engagement to very high levels and is a virtuous cycle for companies that get it right. And, feeding people in need has long been the cornerstone of our corporate responsibility initiatives. Since 2015, we've donated 2.4 billion servings of food to people facing food insecurities. We've reached 3.2 million children through our feeding programs. And again, this is something that the company is very proud to have done, but there is no question in my mind or in anybody here at Kellogg's mind that we would be able to do this without the partnerships that we've developed through food banking around the world. We're incredibly proud to have been a founding member of GFN. We continue to work side by side with them. We're inspired by, Lisa's leadership and, the team there and the work that they do. But it is absolutely foundational to what we do, the partnerships that we have with global food banking networks, because it's the infrastructure that's required to get out there and, serve people in need. And, I'd say one other thing, the COVID-19 obviously has shined a light on these issues that were already there, but in many ways, obviously just made them so much more challenging. And so to your question of, where are we? I think we were making very good progress. We still need to be very constructively discontent about where we are and really pushing forward to make more and more progress. But there's no question we've taken steps backwards because of COVID-19. The silver lining may be that more people are now aware of these issues than perhaps before. Just here in the United States, who would have ever imagined seeing lines of cars stretching miles and miles, with people who needed food? And obviously what we're seeing all around the world is very troubling. And so I think it's time for the world to step up in ways that, it has not yet to date. But, the progress was real, it was being made, but it's just that much more important that it happened. And so I think you've got some great panelists here who are dedicated to doing that, and their work has never been more important than it is today.
Steve, thanks. I see Maria would like to add a comment to your response. Maria, do you please feel free?
¿Puedo opinar? Perdón, no escuché, ¿sí?
Can I say something? I didn't hear.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to add, for us, Kellogg's is one of the big examples of diversity and the shape that this collaboration can take, this collaboration between companies and food banks globally. Of course, we've been working with Kellogg's for decades now with food donation. This is absolutely valuable for us to be able to add to the food value of our packages. But on top of that, with Kellogg's, we've been able to develop a program to rescue food from the fields. We know that the fields, agricultural fields, are the biggest opportunity that we have in Latin America. That is where most losses happen in Latin America. So just in 1 year last year, we were able to recover more than 2,800 tons food and products of the highest quality that otherwise would have been wasted. The team in the national office, the teams in our food banks, they do an excellent job of creating and establishing these relationships with the agricultural actors. But we have, through these companies like Kellogg's, we have the resources so that we can go pick up these products from the fields, bring them to the population and the people that we serve. And we took a step further with Kellogg's because we were able to solidify an educational program, a food educational program in the different communities, because we are delivering more food, more fruits and vegetables, and therefore we need to reinforce the idea. We want to make sure that people take advantage of this food, that they use it. So there is really no limit for companies like Kellogg's that are committed to the 2030 agenda. And, as strategic partners of food banks, there's nothing that can be more important than that.
Thanks, Maria. Thank you for adding to that. Franz, can I turn to you? And you spoke earlier about serving customers, but I think of greater interest to us is how you serve communities where your stores are located. Obviously COVID-19, as you mentioned, has seen some counterintuitive behavior, but it's probably exacerbated some need in communities that are quite vulnerable. what has your approach been in serving those communities and assisting those communities during their time of need?
Yeah, thank you, Crispin. And as I mentioned before, 7,000 communities. As a retailer, you're very close to people. And of course, I also share Liz, her optimism, and Steve, his positive thinking about a lot of things, because a lot of things has been achieved in supporting communities, and the work and the world of the food bank has developed tremendously. At the same time, we also have to be realists, and there's some urgency in my blood, let's say, talking about this topic. 30% of the products produced by farmers will never reach consumers' stomachs. That is a problem in itself in the total food chain, and we talked about it earlier. And the second thing is that a lot of people are in need at the moment. And for me, there's a sort of natural curve, which is not a surprise, but healthy food gives people and children the opportunity to go with a stomach with breakfast to schools, and schools will give education, and education gives careers and gives work and gives also more economic independence. And I think that's where food comes in. And of course, food is a much better prevention for diseases than curing diseases like obesity and diabetes. That's why it's for us so important to make communities strive. And unfortunately, we have too many people in our communities who are not doing well and who need support. And each of our brands has a community engagement program in place to support local needs all year round. And in 2019, we donated more than 56,000 of tons of unsold food to those food banks. Talking about the food banks, they do a remarkable job, and many of them are volunteers and have a huge respect for the food banks. But at the same time, we also would like to give them more support than only food donations. Sometimes they need some help with logistics or IT or cold chain or these kind of areas. And I think also this we should not forget as companies to see where can we help there as well, because that's also important. But you asked me for some exact examples, Crispin, what we are doing. For example, a big driver of our food bank donations is the Food Lion Feeds Company, one of the brands we operate next to Stop and Shop and Giant and Hannaford in the US. And Food Lion is having a Food Lion Feeds program. And over the last 5 years, Food Lion worked with its national hunger and relief partner, Feeding America, and their 30 Feeding America affiliated food banks, because it's a big organization across the brand service territory in the Carolinas in the US. And Food Lion donated so far since 2014 500 million meals, and they set a new goal for themselves of having going to donate by 2025 1 billion meals more. And as Steve already mentioned, this is a huge purpose for our people, huge motivation to help making communities strive. And these kind of donations are very helpful. And there's plenty of opportunities in the total value chain by collaborating with suppliers and manufacturers, collaborating with food banks and other retailers to make this work. Hannaford, another company in the northern part in the state of Maine, has a very clever way also to support food waste. They're now putting a collective together with local farmers, food producers, directly in link with food banks and hunger relief organizations to use the network and to make sure that food does not get lost and that it finds the stomach where it should be. And we talked about it earlier, 30% I mentioned is getting lost. But let's not forget, and we heard this earlier, it's also at our homes that we are not, let's say, paying respect to food, which has been produced in such a difficult and sometimes very difficult circumstances. The Giant Food Company, a company in Pennsylvania, donates money to the food banks in Pennsylvania, the Maryland Food Bank, and these type of things. And this is for our company a great motivator to work harder, because we all have been children. And if you see the number of schools closed in Europe and in the US, where a lot of children got their breakfast, we have to find compensation for that. Now, and then a few things from Europe to across the ocean from the US. We have a lot of partner organizations with Deleuze in Belgium, with Albert Heijn in the Dutch market, with AB Vasilopoulos difficult to pronounce, our Greek company. There's a lot of things going on with food banks. I think the coordination between food banks and retailers, food banks, retailers, and manufacturers is very important, because we can help each other. And also there, if we can help the food banks to organize efficient logistical flows, that will help also that more food arrives in a good shape at the food banks for the volunteers to distribute then to people in need. So those were a few, Crispin, a few hopefully pragmatic and practical examples of what we are doing. And I must say, there's some urgency, I think, if you look at the communities at the moment, and with COVID, we all know that it has not become easier. And those communities which were already vulnerable get more pressure now. So it's us now, and we are obliged to help here and to support. And it is not only in the markets I just mentioned, but also in my little country, the Netherlands. We have 400,000 people every day who go with hunger to bed, and that is in itself completely unacceptable.
Franz, thanks. Yeah, I'm involved in food banking in South Africa and on the continent, and I think we often lose perspective of what happens in the other parts of the world. And I think, listening to some of the statistics you're sharing with us is tragic, but looking at what is being done is really heartwarming. I think, it's congratulations to companies represented on this session this morning for such a progressive approach. And so, yeah, thanks for your contribution. Catherine, you keen to contribute to that topic? Please feel free.
Yes, Franz just gave such a good expose there. I want to follow up on that and say that we can't assume now in the future that the old ways of working work. So we can't assume that the government knows everything, for instance, or that the government is taking care of hunger or those who are hungry. If 400,000 people in the Netherlands are hungry and yet their government is generally very responsive, it's not, something else needs to be done. Same is true, I'm sure, in every country in the world. And so we can't just say whatever was the system before, well, let's just tinker around the edges. We need to think about what the system should be like in each community and how can we make them that way. And I think that's where food banking comes in. We see the huge growth in food banking just in the last, just this year. And because it's the one place where a lot of people, corporations, farmers, well, farmers are sometimes corporate, but anyway, you know what I mean. All different entities can contribute as well as the community. And so I think it's already shown to be really important in this crisis, but it could be just as important over the long term with so many partners working in it. So that's one point. Second point is, well, I guess those are 2 points. One, we can't think the same before. Two, food banking is growing exponentially, and it's for good reason. Three is, as I mentioned before, the communities themselves know where the hunger is. And if we could build more of these community hunger coalitions, which work with, and where companies, farms, all sorts of community groups are involved in those, and where food banking and communal feeding are key, that those organizations of community people can really make a difference in pinpointing where the real issues are and trying to get help. So I'd really like to promote that as something that people can do. I'm sure everybody on the panel has had people come up to them to say, well, what can I do? I don't mean necessarily this year, but in the future, right? And usually you could say, well, you could write a check. Well, not everybody wants to write a check. Some people want to do something else, but look right in your own community. Are the children getting enough to eat at school? Do they have enough to eat during the summer? Where are the poorest areas where people have no access to public transportation and can't get any food? How do we reach them? There are so many things individuals can do, and I think we could promote that much more aggressively and get a lot more participation. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you. I think everyone's been talking a little bit about and reflecting about what could be done, what we've done, and we seem to be at that inflection point, and COVID-19 seems to have been a great place although painful, to reflect, to look at what we've done well and what we haven't, what we've still got to do. Besides being the big disruptor, it's also been referred to as the big reset. Some have referred to it as coming out on the other side, building back better. And so a question to all the panelists, and if I can start with you, Liz, I know you're pressed for time, so if I could start with you. You know, from your perspective, what would you like to see when we get to the tail end of this crazy period in this pandemic, and specifically with reference to the food systems and the food industry? What are the elements you'd like to see in the new world and in this new environment that we have an opportunity to look at with such focused and potentially fresh eyes?
Thank you. I mean, I think we need to have far more collaboration and far more transparency and visibility and openness so that we can actually share information about where the problems are and take action to address them. I mean, it's quite clear that the companies who are being more open and working with their suppliers, they're managing to achieve massive amounts because there is more visibility up and down the chain as to where the issues exist. You know, the decisions made one place in the supply chain have a massive impact elsewhere. So I think it's about having a collective discussion about it. And just coming back to your original question, which is about where are we? You know, increasingly businesses are doing a lot to address food loss and waste. Now, I don't want to say they can ease up now because actually there's far more to do. But there are signs that certainly the momentum is building in the businesses. On the other side, governments, it's basically crap. You know, there are one or two governments who are really engaging in this, but there are an awful lot of governments who are just not engaging with it, not prioritizing it. And I've asked myself a lot, why is it that they're not? And I think it's partly because they don't know what to do and what their role is. So we need to collectively help them understand their role so that they do actually, you know, respond to the consumer pressure. The consumers should be saying, it's not acceptable for food to be put in a landfill. It's not acceptable. It needs to be either diverted or it shouldn't be arising as a waste in the first place. So I think it's about having a collective discussion about this because this is so important. It affects so many people, either through hunger or through obesity and other health issues. So this is something that's so fundamental to our lives. So it's openness and collaboration and involving everybody, the businesses and the governments and the communities.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, Liz has spoken about transparency, visibility, collaboration, you know, greater industry engagement. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, you know, I really just want to build on some of the fantastic points raised. You know, the first thing, I think one of the great ironies of the hunger challenge and of the food loss and waste challenge is that, you know, agriculture and food is one of the biggest employers worldwide. And especially in lower income countries, you know, a lot of the people working in the agriculture and food system, first of all, there's a great percentage of them that are women, but a lot of them also tend to be facing hunger and food insecurity on a regular basis. So for me personally and for us, one thing we talk about is it's so important to, you know, understand the food loss and waste challenge just because those people's labor will be better compensated. They'll see rises in income as we're able to get our hands around that and really solve some of the food access challenges. The second point that I really want to make is that I think there's tremendous opportunity. So, you know, we're working constantly as a global community to try to get better data on how much food is lost and wasted at various points in the supply chain. I know that's always a work in progress, but if we were looking at most recent numbers, food banks are only recovering less than 1% of all that surplus product. Now, not all of that surplus product is edible, but more than less than 1% is. And so I think that one of our challenges is, again, what loss and waste cannot be prevented? How do we build these connections, right? So we can safely redistribute it to people in need. That's a responsibility we as a community of food banks worldwide have really taken on. Definitely the food banks in the United States and Europe have been around for 20, 30 years and more. I mean, in the States, it's been nearly 50 years. But the ones in other parts of the world are still still nascent. And so a huge priority for us is how do we support those systems that are working with the same level of professionalism that you would see from a business, so that they can be partners to the retailers, to the ag producers, to the manufacturers in their communities. And because I think that a lot of this loss and waste is happening, in parts of the world outside of the US and Europe. And so how do we make sure we have those systems in place in the future in countries like India, on the continent of sub-Saharan Africa, throughout Southeast Asia, so that we have strong partners there, that really can capture that. I will say, so like I mentioned, GFN serves food banks in 44 countries, the majority of which are in low and middle income countries. And during the COVID-19 crisis, the response has been incredible. So most of our newest members in emerging markets doubled their capacity to distribute. On average, they increased the number of people they were serving by more than 100,000 people within an 8-week period. And that's because companies, in some cases, governments, concerned individuals came together and said, we care about our communities and investing in this system. So with the right attention, this works on the recovery sense. And so, Franz, I just want to echo what you said. This is not just about donating product. It's not just about donating money. It's about how do we bring together the capabilities of everyone working in the food system to say we care about access, we care about our families, our children having access to food.
Elisa, may I jump in, Crispin here, or is it completely undisciplined? I don't know, but just as a follow-up question for Lisa, because this is really intriguing me. We see a huge job done by the food banks. At the same time, I also see in a number of markets where we work that the capacity of the food bank or the number of food banks is not sufficient to, let's say, absorb more food to distribute. What can we do as private sector and or government to support there to increase that capacity and to get that 1% much higher, because there is a need for food distribution and there is a better destination for good food. Is there something where you can help us to get some directions?
Absolutely. And Maria will also have some comments on this too, because it's something she's building out within Mexico itself. I think there's a couple of different, I'll call it pain points, right, for food banks. The first has to do with the transportation infrastructure. Yep. As Maria talked about, there's a huge amount of ag produce that can be recovered, but there's simply there's no way a food bank, if you're sitting in an agriculturally rich country, can have enough trucks and labor to go into those fields to harvest it and then to pull it into the food bank. Even if the food bank can turn that product around very quickly, which many times the average length of product turn in the GFN network is 3 days, because so many of our food banks work with perishable products. So I think the first thing that we're really looking at is what logistics, transportation partnerships can we be thinking about. We don't need to own all that infrastructure. Are there transportation companies that we can be working with that can help pick up that product and move it more quickly, either to a centralized location for the appropriate sorting and handling, or even, potentially, depending on where it's based, have other distribution points. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I think we're seeing a lot of exciting things happening with technology. Food Cloud, based out of Ireland, has done a terrific piece of technology that several food banks in our network are using that pretty much takes the warehouse of the food bank warehouse out of the equation. The food bank makes sure all the charities know how to handle the product, but they can pick it up from retailers directly or from other donors directly. And then I would say the third point just has to do with logistics, and that's why I think what you were saying with Franz around this. It's really important for us to identify kind of those pain points of transportation and the handling. Now at GFN, we are working with all the food banks on a capital investment budget, just because you don't want to make a ton of investments. You want to remain lean, but there is some things that really need to be considered. And our priority with that is really in the emerging markets where you're not seeing the same capability to take food, whether it be cold chain or some of the transportation challenges. But Maria, you might have more to add to that.
Maria, just as you, thanks Lisa, just before you add, if I could just speak to some of the 300 delegates gathered here, just please feel free to consider your question and enter that into the Q&A slot under the Q&A box at the bottom, and I'll start dealing with those questions as they come through. I'm going to go to Maria, and then we'll give the audience and the registered participants an opportunity to ask their questions. Maria?
Muchas gracias. Aprecio mucho la pregunta.
Thank you very much. I appreciate Francis' question very much, because you have that commitment of going beyond what would be expected of a company trying to achieve those objectives. It's been a challenge in Mexico, continues to be a challenge to have this impact in the industry, try to make everybody be active. Last year, we advanced a lot. In August, we were able, with the leaders of corporate councils here in Mexico, we were able to have the first corporate council against food waste and loss. Trying to distribute more our message and see what their active role has to be. And that's the first thing. They themselves have to see themselves as responsible, and so that we can act, we can create this cascade with all the companies that are part of this organization, so that they can participate, they can deliver their surplus food, deliver food that has short days, but that's still uh, healthy. So definitely this work with those associations has been very positive. But speaking to what's needing and how can we have partnerships that impact our job better, definitely logistics, as Lisa was saying, logistics for the rescue. We sometimes, some years we have to reject 6,000 to 8,000 tons of product because we don't have the capacity to respond timely, to pick up, to deliver safely to the food bank, so they can in turn deliver to beneficiaries. The delivery logistics is complex. There are communities that are almost impossible to reach, and they need that food assistance. They need food banks to be close, and we have companies reaching that last mile, doing that last mile, reaching the most difficult communities to reach. So how we work on that logistics, so that we deliver the food where it's needed, so we can have a partnership there, just focusing on reaching those people in need. Technology, well, definitely we need technology to develop for the service of food banks and to respond to this logistic challenge that we have, to be able to respond quickly. Partners are calling us today, and in a matter of hours or the next day, we have to be there collecting the food. How can we have technology providing us access to the best transportation technologies, and also to see what the opportunities, which are the banks that should be receiving the product at that moment. And the other thing is, there's a list of activities where technology could have an important impact on our operations. And to also publicize what you're doing to help the food banks, to publicize the results of those partnerships, so that people become sensitized to see this. They see that there's twin problems: the food waste and loss and food insecurity. And through communication media, we need to disseminate those actions that need to be undertaken. What is the private sector doing in cooperation with food banks? That's something that's very important, needs to be uh, disseminated. And something that I would like to see in our countries is a different mechanism for handling the best buy food labels and the expiration dates. There's a lot of food that's being wasted that way. Why cannot we promote a change in this area? Together, the private sector and food banks, we can have an effect on public policy, maybe on the legislative side. Maybe we can do those underlying changes that allow us to better fight food waste and loss and food insecurity. I'm very convinced that those companies that really are involved in this more holistic function will have a better impact. That's what I would like to see. That is something that's within your value chain. That's something that's an intrinsic part of it. You know, that redistribution of surplus food is part of your value chain. That's something that's included to get to the food banks. That's something that does not require any additional operation. So we need to take advantage of these opportunities.
Thank you. Thanks, Maria. We now have the opportunity to take questions from the participants, and my my chat box and my question and answer box is filling up quite quickly here, so we've got a real engaged audience. The first question is a fairly practical question from Jacques van der Schenk, and I think it's directed mainly at you, Franz, and now Steve, if you after that wish to comment, you're more than welcome to. And the question is, what is your group's policy in terms of the right time before due by date and expiry date for donating surplus food to food banks? So I think that's a fairly practical, on the ground type of question, and I'll lead with a follow-on question after that.
Yep, but it's and thank you, Jacques. I think, Crispin, this is also a very valid question, because we would like to make sure that food which we pass on or donate is still safe food. And we have a lot of local legislation, of course, with shelf life and due dates. And so well within the due date, we donate food, so it has still time to come to communities and food banks. So we work within the legislation there, and also communities in need, of course, deserve healthy and safe food. So it depends a little bit about legislation, country by country, where we operate, but that's the answer to it. And that's why we also take products out of the shelf, let's say 2 or sometimes 3 days before expiry, to make sure that it still can make the way in a safe way to food banks and consumers.
Yeah, Crispin, we have essentially the same policy, and it does vary by different legislative areas. But I think Maria raises an excellent point, this whole notion of best before versus expiry, because very often an expiration date doesn't mean that food is not safe. It just means it's not as optimal, perhaps, but for a hungry person, it would be quite useful. So I think just a more cohesive strategy around that, country by country would go a long way and make a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Steve.
The strange thing is here, Crispin, we have very much a mutual interest here, right? I mean, what Steve just mentioned is also our interest to have a little bit more days on the packaging to sell products, because otherwise it might run into shrink, or it might not be able to donate. So I think there we have a thing to do together with government support to get a few things changed there, because there are logically safety measures that we have a little bit more dates on the milk. That's possible as well, and I think that would help us a lot. And I'm fully supporting Maria's argument that sometimes food is not being seen as edible anymore, although, like Steve mentioned, the food is still in a very good quality.
Thank you. Thanks, Franz. Steve. Catherine, if I can turn to you. There's a response from Eduard, who says, thank you for raising the point about research on post-harvest losses. Some people have been asking why they should increase production, investing in expensive inputs with volatile or even non-existent markets for the product. If they have to lose a big part of the harvest, especially in Africa, how do we ensure we get to know the extent of the loss, the causes of the loss, and the implications before the strategic recommendations are developed? So I think that really talks to kind of using the reporting and the insights to make better policy and planning decisions.
Right, and the policy and planning decisions that come, again, from governments or from, governments at any level, really, should be informed by research. It's not always a natural connection. So I'm afraid it's going to take a lot of effort by those involved in the private sector and in the community sector to remind governments that if they don't have all the information, that all the information is not yet in. I don't think, thinking of any, at least local governments that I know, that they would necessarily be thinking about the farmer's loss and considering that in terms of any kind of policy that they make. So I think it's something that they have to be educated about, and we definitely, we collectively in the community have a lot to say about that. I think, again, that the larger private sector companies can have some more of an influence on government, reminding them about the scope of things that they should be thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you. And then to Lisa and Maria, and I think Steve, you may want to weigh into this as well, is much as the 10 by 2030 initiative calls for involvement from all sectors in the supply chain, truly impactful food banks must forge effective partnerships with a wide variety of stakeholders. What can companies at different stages of the supply chain do to support the work of food banks? So I'm going to hand to you, Lisa, and then to Maria, and whoever would like to respond. Steve, if you'd like to respond after that, no pleasure. Lisa.
Yeah, so I think as Franz and Steve and Maria have shared, that there's an opportunity for I would argue all companies, all stakeholders in a community to be involved in some way. Obviously there's always an opportunity for financial investment, but there's absolutely needs for, I'll just say, capabilities with local food banks. I'll give you some examples. We are currently working with two financial firms. One is actually doing a lot of economic projection for us that looks at kind of how food prices, how local economies could be affecting, different, essentially, food availability and food demand trends over the short and medium term. And that really is helping our members project when they're thinking about supply. In this environment, obviously, it's a fast changing environment with a lot of risk involved. And so we have another firm that's partnering with us and our members, kind of doing risk assessment on that to help with planning and the like. And so, from an employee engagement perspective, once it is safe to do in-person events again, there's obviously lots of opportunities for packing to helping with distribution, but increasingly we're seeing needs on the skills-based or the capabilities-based side. And so I definitely think for companies that are wanting to be involved, the first step is to reaching out to their local food bank. If they're wanting to have an impact on a national scale, reaching out to the National Association. Of course, if they have locations in several countries, we would love to have a conversation with them about how we might be able to leverage their unique skills and assets kind of towards this common goal, because we need to come together more than ever.
Thanks, Lisa. Maria, do you want to add to that?
Sí, estoy totalmente de acuerdo.
I totally agree. In these last few times, we've been working to try to build partnerships with companies that are not just in the food industry, but those companies that can help us strengthen our operations. We just started a partnership that's going to allow us to keep like maintenance and equipment renewal, refrigeration equipment renewal. Those are things that are basic for us, so important. Everything that has to do with our transportation and the vehicles, and we're working on that. And I don't think there's a limit to it, and that's one of the things that we need to remember. In the private sector, we have all these companies that could play a very active role working with us, regardless of what their activity is. We can develop special projects. We can have them share the talent with us, so that we can reach our maximum potential as a part of the civil society, working in these partnerships with the private sector. I believe there's really no limit, and that is what Lisa was talking about regarding planning. That is what we're doing. We're creating a partnership so we can work on our strategic planning, and we can work on financial transactions. So any companies in that sector can work with us too. And of course, the expectation is that we are able to work in a way that has a lot bigger impact and to show bigger results, and to prevent, of course, food loss and waste, and increase food security.
Yeah, I guess, Crispin, what I would add to that is, it's a great question. If you're a company that's looking to add value to the food banking network, was a question. I think you have to start with kind of two questions. What's your capabilities that would be valuable to the networks? What capabilities do you have that you could lend, number one? And number two, perhaps more important, what is your purpose as an organization? And how can you link your purpose back into this work? Because the purpose is important because it'll drive sustainability. It's not just about writing a check, because then another good cause will come around and then another one and another one. But you look at what Franz is talking about and what I'm talking about. I mean, we like to say that, you know, we're morning people. We started as a breakfast company. So things like school feeding programs and breakfast programs are, you know, they fit in to our capabilities as a food company, to our heritage as a breakfast company, and our purpose as, you know, providing meals that nourish families. And that's what makes it sustainable and last over time. So I would just really focus on those two critical questions. Link your purpose to it, it'll become sustainable. Lend your capabilities where it really adds value.
Oh, that's such a great point, Steve. We often in food forward in South Africa talk about donor fatigue, and donor fatigue sets in once there's not an alignment of vision and purpose. And once there's an alignment of vision and purpose between the two, it's sustainable. Otherwise, one of the parties tire eventually, and it's likely to be the donor. Good point. Steve, there's a specific question directed at you, but I presume the question is to you and the peer group companies where the group Kellogg's finds itself in, and that's how do companies like Kellogg's and your peer group companies measure waste loss progress, and is this part of sustainability? Are there sustainability goals? I presume internal KPIs on that, and are they also looking for, are there new solutions being tested within the supply, outside of the supply chain, not just within the supply chain, to deal with food waste and food loss? And that's from Sandra Wagner.
Yeah, so at Kellogg, and really virtually all of our peer group companies, we have quite a number of sustainability goals around, you know, this topic: food loss, food waste, around environmental footprint, around packaging. And I think a lot of progress is really being made. And I said at the beginning, you know, we're very, very efficient when it comes to food loss and food waste. And that's why we were so encouraged by the 10 by 20 by 30, because we have to really think outside of our footprint in order to continue to make progress. But that's why we signed up for, you know, Champions 12.3, along with our other peer group companies, because progress has to be made in a much more collaborative fashion. But, you know, rest assured, I think the peer group companies are working very collaboratively together and have very ambitious goals through 2030 and beyond.
Thanks, Steve. I need to apologize to Catherine, and Catherine, I'm going to go straight to you. Catherine particularly wanted to weigh in on the issue of purpose. So please, sorry for missing that comment.
Steve, I think you struck an important chord about purpose and ensuring that whatever any organization does fits its purpose, and then it's sustainable. Lisa mentioned women and girls earlier in her presentation, and reminds me of the time when I was at the World Food Program, and we were working on getting not only transport of food, but then what happens afterwards. If our mission was to end hunger, how are we going to be sure that actually that was done? And we realized that we needed to partner with the cooks, because they were the ones in the families that were actually committed to ending hunger. And then when we defined who cooks were throughout the developing world, those were women, mothers, grandmothers, girls, aunts. And so it became a focus that was sustainable, that we needed to highlight the roles of women and therefore include them in our decision-making process and our activities. So I think, building on your mention of purpose, that for us who are in this business of working against hunger, that we can't forget the people who actually are most committed in most households for this purpose, whether they have enough resources or not, and those are the women. And to the extent that we can be sure that we've included them in these policy discussions, and even inventing ways to be sure that we have women's voices in the policy discussions, we can probably have much stronger solutions come as a result. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. I've got a question from Alan Gilbertson, and I guess there's an opportunity for both sides to answer this question. And the question is, what's the one single biggest change that food banks should consider in order to be even better partners to companies in the private sector, and obviously vice versa. So, I'm going to throw that to you, Franz. I mean, the food banks you work with, if you were to offer a constructive criticism, what are the things you would want in a food banking partner for them to be better partners? And then I'll throw the question to you, Lisa, and probably to Maria, who works with the food banks. What would you like to see in your food donor partners a little bit better for that relationship to be a little bit more effective and efficient? I hope I've captured the question well. Franz?
Thank you, Crispin. Constructive criticism is not so much in my language when I talk on our collaboration with the food banks, because I have a high respect for the banks itself. But we have a good conversation with them, a good dialogue with them, how we can improve our partnership. And there's one thing which is not so easy in our present world of food safety, regulation, and technology. And that is that a lot of things are moving very fast in legislation as well. And I think there if food banks are more receptive also to the change, and companies and private sector are more receptive to donate services and capabilities, was a little bit my question before, and then I think we can increase the capacity of the food banks quite a bit. It's not so much, I think, the food quantities in itself or the people in need we can serve. It's also the capacity of the bridge from available unsold food, for example, to the people. The second thing I would call out is that I think there's one thing we did not talk about a lot today, because we talked about decision makers and people who can influence in a very positive sense, being females and young women, which are fully underlined. But the other thing is that there is also, of course, in food banks a big topic of shame as well, and you can be very fast in trouble from a food security point of view when you lose a job, when you're in COVID, when the children you nourish are not nourished anymore by schools and these kind of things. It can go very fast. And how are we going to support those people who come into a trouble situation in a dignified way? And a lot of people also in my country do not go to food banks because they don't want to be seen there, because they think, hey, it's a difficult way to get there. And it's also has to do with self-respect. So I think we have to find an opportunity. And there, for example, there are some things that some of our food banks in a number of markets where we operate look like small stores where you just can shop, and therefore gives a much better feeling to the food bank customers as such. And that whole matter of dignity, respect, I think we also have to pay attention to that, how we can improve that as well.
Sure. Thanks, Franz. Good insight. Thank you very much. Lisa, the vice versa part of the question.
Right. I think what Franz had said about the dignity piece is so important. And I think that we as a community of food banks need to be thinking about how do we make our the food that we're providing more accessible to people in a dignified way. We're seeing a really interesting approach, for example, for our partner in Shanghai, who is actually basing some of her distribution points at retailers themselves. So, the shoppers that come in, they can experience it in the same way that they would if they had access to the commercial side of the supply chain. So I think that those types of models absolutely need to be explored more. From our perspective, and I think that companies, especially, we're seeing a trend, I would say, with companies that really want to be working with community-based organizations longer term. So I think we're going to see more of this. But from a food bank perspective, we would love to work hand in hand with the company on the product donation side and understand what their processes are, so we can see how we can integrate the donation of surplus product more regularly into their processes. And that allows for more, I think, seamless work. It assures food safety in the process, making sure that things are not being distributed that aren't past state code, those types of things, and really making sure we're developing pickup and donation schemes that are compatible with what the company is doing. So that would be our one kind of secret sauce that we've learned works.
Thanks, Lisa. I do have to unfortunately call it there. We are at a point where we've run out of time on a great conversation. I hope this becomes a more regular annual event, Lisa. I think this is the first of its kind. So, I'm struck. So firstly, my apologies to those who have posted questions, and we've just run out of time in getting your questions answered. But just in closing, it strikes me that there are a couple of great insights. And the first insight for me certainly is the central role that food security, and by converse food loss and waste, plays, the elimination of loss and waste plays in so many of the other SDGs, and our central access to food is, and broadening access to food. The second thing that strikes me is that COVID has been a challenging time, but it also has given us a period to reflect, because it has really exacerbated the fissures in society, those who have access and those who don't. And it also shows us, just through some of Franz's comments, how precarious many societies are. They literally take something small like this for them to move into a space of great need. The third thing that's exacerbated my anxiety is that we are 10 years from, we have 10 years effectively to moderate the behavior of a global community with regards to their attitude with food and food waste. And it sounds like a long time. It's a decade ahead of us. But listening to you, a lot has been done. But it strikes me that so much still has to be done. And time is clearly not on our side. And then finally, what has struck me is the tremendous commitment where we have come, the tremendous commitment that the private sector, that large corporations like Kellogg's, like all the other retailers have done. It has really struck me that there's a lot of progress being made, that people are taking a progressive attitude towards food and food security and eliminating waste. And then also the work that's being done on policy. Some of these things aren't just practical. We're actually thinking about it in our planning cycles. There's KPIs in place, as Steve has pointed out. So internally within organizations, it's finding its way into planning and policy. And I think that's really insightful and encouraging. So I have nothing more to do here than to thank you all, not only for your time here, but for many of you so far, the lifetime spent on investing in thinking through broader access to food, broader access to quality nutrition, and the work you do not only in the last few minutes here, but in the work you do outside of this call. I'm certainly driven to a higher level of action, and I really do want to thank you very much for the contribution you're making to bringing this issue of food loss and food waste to the fore. To Lisa, the Global Food Banking Network, and to the champions of Sustainable Development Goal 12.3, thank you very much for co-hosting this. Thank you everybody for your time, and best wishes for the work that you do.